Welcome to the second video in this module. In this video, we will define dialectics and explore the roots of this term in philosophy, first with Socrates and then with Hegel. Finally, we will take a look at how Dr. Marshall Linehan applied this concept to mental health. So let's get started. So like we mentioned in the previous video, dialectics is actually a term borrowed from philosophy. If you remember from the previous video, we defined dialectics as this idea of bringing together opposites. In other words, looking at things from new or different perspectives. So the idea of dialectics is two things that seem like opposites can actually sometimes both be true at the same time. On a practical level, dialectics is all about this idea of balanced thinking or flexible thinking or nuanced thinking or maybe seeing the shades of gray or letting go of extremes. Dialectics is about finding a middle path. It's also about seeing things from someone else's perspective, or maybe seeing things from different angles in your own head. And dialectics is especially about changing your mind when presented with new information. In other words, the ability to update your cognitive map, so to speak. So, like I mentioned, dialectics comes from philosophy. And it was actually originally Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher, who popularized this term dialectics. The term probably existed before Socrates, but he was the one that made the term popular within philosophical circles. And Socrates was famous for his teaching style. Socrates taught his students not by giving them the answers, but instead by simply asking them questions. The purpose of his questions were to help his students see things from different perspectives. And he was so good at this teaching style that he could actually get his students to the point of articulating the exact opposite viewpoint of where they started. And he simply did that by asking them question after question after question. To this day, we still call this technique the Socratic method. And it's still a great technique to use in counseling. But now let's fast forward to the 1800s to a German philosopher named Hegel. Now, Hegel's contribution to dialectics was that he applied this concept beyond philosophy to all academic disciplines. So what Hegel realized was it wasn't just Socrates and his students that learned to be dialectical. It wasn't just people that studied the discipline of philosophy that learned to be dialectical. Really, this is how all human knowledge tends to evolve. And in particular, Hegel developed this three-pronged scheme to explain how human knowledge tends to evolve dialectically. So first of all, Hegel noticed that someone generally tends to come up with some good idea, an explanation, to account for some kind of phenomenon or a set of observations or maybe some data points. And they come up with a theory, and that theory is the thesis. The thesis becomes the prevailing paradigm. So now this is how everyone tends to understand this particular phenomenon or data points. But then inevitably what happens is someone else comes along and notices maybe some outliers or a different set of observations or some additional data points that the original theory doesn't account for. So this person comes up with their own theory. It's kind of an alternative explanation. And from Hegel's scheme, this was called the antithesis. So now we have two competing theories in operation here. What also happens is someone else comes along and says, now wait a minute. If we take both of these explanations into account, we can actually integrate them. There's pros and cons to both of these perspectives. There's a grain of truth to both of these theories. And if we look at all of these data points from yet another angle, we can account for all of this with one single theory or one single explanation. And Hegel called that the synthesis. Then the synthesis basically becomes the new thesis, and the whole cycle just continues to repeat itself. So let me just give you a really simple example. If you're struggling to understand or believe this concept of dialectics, let me just tell you that the entire research process is extremely dialectical. The scientific method is very dialectical, but also any research journal. If you don't believe in dialectics, apparently you've never read a research journal because research journals contradict themselves all the time. So, for example, you might come across one study that says, well, wine is good for you. But then you might come across another study that says, well, actually, wine is bad for you. And then you're going to be like, well, which study is right? They're saying different things here. But then, ultimately, there will be some kind of meta-analysis that might look at a review of maybe 100 different studies on wine. And a lot of times that meta-analysis will come to the very conclusive decision that, well, wine can be either good for you or bad for you because it depends on your age or your sex or the quantity that you're consuming or the frequency or the kind of alcohol that you're consuming. So it's more nuanced than it's just good or bad. So that's what we mean by dialectics. That right there is that whole process of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So now let's fast forward to the late 1900s, Dr. Marshall Linehan. Marshall Linehan applied this concept of dialectics to mental health. So what Marshall Linehan realized was it's not just philosophers or scientists or scholars who learn to think dialectically. Really, dialectics is how all healthy adults learned to think and process. If you think about it, that makes sense because life is complex. Life is nuanced. Life is full of contradictions. Life is also full of constant changes. So therefore, dealing with life requires balanced and flexible responses. So if you think about it, effective decision-making requires that you be able to think about things like cause and effect, short-term versus long-term, pros and cons. Those are all dialectical processes. We do this all the time, whether we realize it or not. For example, just think of the last time you were at some kind of business meeting or staff meeting. So at a staff meeting, everyone shares a perspective, and yet by the end of the meeting, the group comes to some kind of consensus, and then you move forward with some kind of specific action items. That's dialectics in operation. But it doesn't even have to be something we do in our professional life. Dialectics is something we do in our personal lives all the time. For example, just to figure out what to do for lunch today, you will have to use some kind of dialectics. You'll probably have to think through what are the pros and cons of maybe just grabbing some fast food? What are the pros and cons of maybe just heating up some leftovers? What are the pros and cons of skipping lunch altogether and just catching up on emails? You will think through several different options and you'll come to a decision, probably in a split second. But what Marshall Linehan noticed was that psychopathology is often associated with a breakdown in dialectical processes. What would happen if you couldn't think through things like pros and cons, cause and effect, short-term versus long-term? What would happen if you couldn't see things from different perspectives? What would happen if you had a belief and you were stuck on that belief and you couldn't update that belief, even if there was lots of new evidence? That would cause problems. So, therefore, what Marshall Linehan realized was that healing from mental illness often requires a restoration of dialectics. In other words, finding the middle balance. Because as we're going to see when we talk more about trauma and the effects of trauma, trauma is an extreme situation, and trauma triggers extreme responses. So what happens to trauma survivors is a lot of times they're caught at the extremes. In other words, that's a breakdown of dialectics. So therefore, healing requires a restoration of dialectics, being able to let go of the extremes and finding a middle path again. And trauma survivors do have very predictable sets of dialectical dilemmas. In other words, extremes that they're caught at. And so let's summarize with a few key points. In this video, we learned the term dialectics comes from philosophy. Dialectics refers to the process of bringing together opposites, which also implies being able to look at something from multiple perspectives. To be dialectical means that you can see the grain of truth in two opposing views, that you are balanced and flexible in your thinking, and that you can see shades of gray instead of only the extremes of black or white. Key point number 2. Socrates was a Greek philosopher who coined the term dialectics. Socrates taught his students by asking them lots of questions so that they could start to see things from different perspectives. In fact, sometimes even the opposite perspective from their initial starting point. This teaching style is still referred to as the Socratic method. Key point number 3. Hegel was a German philosopher who realized that it was not just philosophy students who learned to be dialectical. Rather, this is how all collective human knowledge tends to evolve. Hegel articulated the sequence of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And finally, key point number 4. Marshall noticed that psychopathology is often associated with a breakdown in dialectical processes. Therefore, healing from mental illness often requires a restoration of dialectical thinking, or finding the middle path between extremes. Trauma survivors have a characteristic set of dialectical dilemmas which need to be reconciled as part of their healing process.